Hi, my name's Suneel Jethani. I'm from the University of Melbourne. That means that I'm really jet lagged, and that also means that I'm going to rely heavily on reading some of this paper rather than just sort of working through the slides. So this is a fairly loose methodological paper. It's not designed to show you finished work. It's more of an invitation to think about how some of the ideas that I'm presenting might be of use to others and might be relevant to others engaged in the critical study of data and data processes. So, this paper represents several years of discussion around the nature of data between myself and my colleague at Monash University, Robbie Fordyce, on the politics surrounding the nature of data extraction, acquisition, and processing. It is a piece of work that is still forming, and it attempts to bring together material from various research projects conducted by both of us separately. Our initial thinking was to explore qualitative methodologies that could be applied to the critical study of data regimes in a post-Cambridge Analytica research environment. Matters of data acquisition, motility, and transformation, as many others here would argue, have become more pressing in recent times with a number of changes to legislation and policy around data privacy, consumer rights to data, data sharing and release worldwide. Although this paper was conceived as a provocation towards methodological innovation, its goal is not to present a fully figured out approach to addressing the challenges associated with data acquisition, extraction, transformation, and motility for the purposes of informing critical research within the humanities and social sciences. Rather, the goal of this paper and the larger piece of collaborative work that arises out of it is to establish a formalized discourse among researchers with an interest in critical data studies about how we might foreground these issues in a way that coheres with standard conventions through which we communicate our research: the peer-reviewed paper, book chapters, grant applications, discussion papers, and conference talks like this one. In what follows, I want to discuss methodological challenges associated with three modes of critical data research: doing work that draws from pre-existing data either directly from its source or in some enriched format, cleaned, annotated, de-identified, aggregated, linked, accessed via an API, and two, doing work where processes of data collection, extraction, acquisition, transformation, processing, and interpretation are in themselves an object of analysis, and three, where these two modes of inquiry form the basis of research ethics applications for work occurring as partnerships between the academy and the private sector. I want to start this discussion by mounting an argument for the notion of provenance, where a piece of data comes from and how it came into being operationalized for certain purposes. This term is borrowed loosely and with a fair degree of interpretive license from other disciplines, namely information sciences and biological sciences. For the purposes of this paper, the central concern is the conditions under which data are transported from the control of one entity to another, and how an analysis of the relations underscoring this shape the critique of data-centric research and data-centric regimes more generally. Let me share with you an event that occurred during the preparation of this paper that demonstrates the pressing need for new methodological thinking in this area. On the 5th of June, just before 11:30 a.m, the Sydney offices of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, one of the nation's two publicly funded broadcasters, was raided by the Australian Federal Police. The warrant served in this instance was exceptionally broad. The AFP could add, copy, delete, or alter the data they acquired as necessary. The raids on the Australian Broadcasting Corporation sought details about the leaking of national security information regarding, among other things, the Australian Signals Directorate's use of spying powers on Australian citizens and the actions of Australian soldiers who were flying Nazi flags in Afghanistan. ASIO's top spy was namelessly quoted in the June 7 edition of the Sydney Morning Herald, stating that these leaks were seriously damaging in the context of the Signals Directorate. It also is worth noting that the warrant included the provision of data from key logging and tracking software. The transmission of data in cases like this represents the recontextualization of data from one space to another and is expressed in the ideas of the crisis of Cambridge Analytica, where a private research company extracted data from Facebook and used it to engage in psychometric profiling. This chain of approach is also effectively the same chain that the Australian Federal Police is examining, trying to find a causal linked relationship between soldiers in Afghanistan and journalists at the ABC. These terms are useful insofar as they present an ends and means approach to understanding the origins and implementations of data with an eye to a more accurate research agenda. Our thinking is that this notion of provenance might be an interesting object of analysis when studying data-driven decision-making, storytelling, and insight generation. In the use of data provenance, the term operates to question the relationship between data, their source, with a specific emphasis on the political and/or legislative aspects of transacting and extraction of data, which is to say that we wish to add to the notion of why provenance and where provenance a notion of how provenance, which is to say how is access to data made possible in the first place. This approach extends questions of power, law, literacy, and permissions in an entangled way, and notes how these factors shape the cascade of data from one context to another. It helps to map out a few forms of what we call how provenance, and for example, the how provenance of, say, open data represents data that has been produced in one context but designed for distribution to others without the need to register or justify secondary uses. Therefore, provenance becomes a matter of trust, engagement, reciprocity, or obligation between parties, the publisher and the user. The provenance of stolen passwords in, for instance, the series of password releases known as collections 1 to 5, by contrast, represents data for which the provenance after acquisition is secretive and clandestine. To borrow from Bunneman et al., the nature of provenance is generally articulated in two forms. Where, as in where did it come from? This, they claim, is a general approach that people take in understanding provenance of any given piece of data as it operates as an error or quality checking mechanism. From the perspective of where provenance, any given point in a database should relate, whether directly or through mediation, to a real-world event or object. Thank you. In this sense, it is a form of methodological and medial positivism that ensures correspondence between a dataset and what that dataset claims to represent. Where provenance is, in essence, a question of accuracy, a question that is referentially solved in Merkle tree implementation. It is also the kind of category error that Safia Umoja Noble raises in her book, Algorithms of Oppression, as a tendency towards heightened social biases and contradictions that result in certain peculiarities in datasets. Bunneman et al. Pose a second form of provenance, which they term why provenance, as in why has this piece of data been collected and why is it included in a particular dataset and why is it subject to particular sets of relations. This approach is a pragmatist approach to understanding the tools that were used to generate these data, i.e. by what mechanism. This question is a question of method. For research in the humanities and social sciences, this is often a question about the platform used and the corresponding tool for extraction. Was it scraped, accessed via API, or accessed through direct digital transfer of files between parties? In Automating Inequality, Virginia Eubanks proposes that an inquiry that has similarities to why provenance, suggesting problems not only with surveillance of the poor, destitute, homeless, and unlucky among us, but that the distribution of surveillance technology is overwhelmingly extractive of disadvantaged people to begin with. And here we might have a view, data-driven surveillance, we might view data-driven surveillance in what Jonah Bosewicz and Aram Sinwright call a quest for strategic agency beyond the panopticon, where literacies around data obfuscation and creation means of subverting power symmetries within potentially surveillant information flows become acts of micro-resistance and opportunities for control, depending on which way one looks at it. So, a translation of these ideas into practice of who, what, when, where, how, and why provenance is a translation about the possible changes, is a translation being made possible through changes to research governance, where the terms and conditions of commercial web platforms and third-party data handling companies may end up being enforced on academic research. I've got some examples from Australia that I won't get through because they're fairly technical and just in the interest of time. But I'll conclude with the terms and conditions of a website, privacy impact assessment, employment contract, consent form, or search warrant do not readily or adequately address how de-identification events, new data sharing agreements, breaches, changes to hosting, or data maintenance agreements or other forms of data weaponization might be handled, or if or how they might be reported to those affected. Here we see potential to at least understand provenance through the auspices under which the data is being put to work through combative, brokered, or open channels. From this sketch, in the final slide, is an ontology of provenance that is still in formation through continued exploration of this topic. What I wish to raise is that forms of provenance accumulate from transaction to transaction, cascading along as a dataset picks up the types of provenance that have led to its creation. It may involve multiple forms of overlapping provenance, methodological, epistemological, legal, illegal, which cascade and modulate different elements and apparatuses. Thank you.